In the dark, narrow streets of Paris in the year 1720, a carriage careened wildly over the cobblestones, its curtains drawn tight against a howling mob that demanded blood. The passengers inside terrified for their lives as stones shattered the windows and the roar of "Hang him!" echoed off the walls of the palace, marking the violent end to the greatest financial delusion in history. But to understand how a single man could drive the most powerful kingdom in Europe to the brink of total anarchy, we must go back not to the banking halls of Paris, but to a misty morning in London 26 years earlier, where a handsome, arrogant young Scotsman named John Law stood facing a rival in a duel, a pistol in his hand and a reckless gamble in his heart. Born to a family of goldsmiths, Law was a mathematical prodigy who understood numbers better than he understood people. A man who saw the world not as a collection of moral choices, but as a series of probabilities to be calculated and exploited. Yet his brilliance was matched only by his impulsiveness, and after shooting his opponent dead in Bloomsbury Square, he was sentenced to hang a fate. He escaped only by drugging his guards, soaring through the bars of his cell, and leaping 30 feet into freedom, beginning a life of exile that would see him wander the gambling halls of Amsterdam, Venice, and Genoa, studying the flow of money with the obsession of a scientist and the nerves of a high-stakes poker player. While Law was refining his theories on credit and currency, France was slowly dying, suffocated by the majestic but ruinous ambition of the Sun King Louis XIV, whose endless wars and construction of Versailles had drained the treasury dry. Leaving behind a nation where the peasantry starved, the currency was debased, and the debt was so colossal that the interest payments alone exceeded the total tax revenue of the kingdom. When the old king finally died in 1715, he left the throne to a 5-year-old child, and the regency to the Duke of Orleans, a man of hedonistic tastes and desperate circumstances, who found himself staring into the abyss of national bankruptcy, a situation so dire that ministers openly debated declaring the state insolvent and wiping out the savings of every citizen in France. Into this vacuum of leadership stepped John Law, the fugitive Scotsman, who walked into the Palais Royal not with a weapon, but with an idea that was far more dangerous. He proposed that money was not gold or silver, which were scarce and hard to transport, but rather confidence, a shared belief that could be printed on paper and backed by the credit of the state, a concept so revolutionary that it sounded like alchemy to the traditionalists of the court. Desperate and out of options, the regent gave Law permission to establish the Banque Générale, the first bank in France to issue paper money, and to the shock of the skeptics, it worked brilliantly at first, as the paper notes were accepted to pay taxes, and trade flourished, breathing life back into the sclerotic French economy, and earning Law the trust of the government. Emboldened by this success, Law launched the second phase of his grand scheme, a venture that would become synonymous with greed and madness. He acquired the Mississippi Company. A trade monopoly granted the exclusive rights to the vast, mysterious French territories in North America, a land purportedly flowing with gold and emeralds, though in reality it was a swamp-filled wilderness inhabited by alligators and hostile tribes. Law, however, was the world's first true marketing genius, and he launched a propaganda campaign of modern proportions, parading native kings through the drawing rooms of Paris and circulating engravings of smiling colonialists lounging by mountains of silver, igniting a spark of curiosity that he fanned into a roaring inferno of speculation by linking the bank to the company and allowing investors to pay for shares using his own paper money. The result was a feedback loop of financial insanity, as the price of Mississippi shares began to climb first slowly, then vertically doubling and tripling in value within weeks, drawing in not just the wealthy nobility, but the desperate poor, the clergy, the soldiers and the servants, all of whom scrambled to buy a piece of the dream. The epicenter of this mania was the Rue Quincampoix, a narrow, filthy street where the stock market operated, a place that became so crowded with frantic speculators that neighboring houses were rented out for exorbitant sums, and one enterprising hunchback reportedly made a fortune by renting out his back as a writing desk for traders to sign contracts. For a brief, dazzling moment, John Law was the uncrowned king of France, a foreigner who had made everyone rich, a magician who had banished poverty with the printing press. And the hysteria reached such a fever pitch that the term millionaire was coined specifically to describe the new class of super-rich emerging from the chaos of the Rue Quincampoix. Dukes and duchesses waited in his antechamber for hours just to beg for the privilege of buying shares, and Law, once a fugitive murderer, was now the Controller General of Finances, the most powerful man in Europe, controlling the mint, the tax collection, and the colonial trade, effectively merging the entire French economy into a single conglomerate under his command. But the laws of economics, unlike the laws of men, cannot be bribed or charmed, and the foundation of Law's empire was rotting from the inside, for he had committed the cardinal sin of banking. He had printed far more paper money than there was gold to back it, using the fresh currency to pump up the price of shares in a company that was generating zero profits, a Ponzi scheme of national proportions that relied entirely on the continued belief that the paper was as good as gold.
And the gold.
The cracks began to show when a few savvy investors, sensing the air getting thin, quietly began to cash in their paper notes for hard specie, converting their winnings into gold, silver and diamonds to smuggle out of the country, a trickle of withdrawals that Law tried to stop with increasingly desperate authoritarian measures. He devalued gold, he outlawed the ownership of more than a small amount of precious metals, and he even encouraged citizens to inform on their neighbors who were hoarding coin, turning the country into a police state of monetary surveillance, where the police could burst into homes to search for hidden louis d'or. The tipping point came when a Grand Prince, the Prince de Conti, enraged by Law's refusal to sell him shares at a discount, sent 3 wagons to the bank headquarters to demand the conversion of his enormous paper holdings into gold, a public vote of no confidence that shattered the fragile illusion Law had built. Panic, cold and terrifying, swept through Paris as the realization hit the population that the paper in their pockets was worthless, merely rags with ink, and the stampede to the bank began. A human tidal wave of terrified depositors screaming for their life savings, crushing people to death in the press of the crowd, their bodies trampled into the mud of the street while the guards looked on in helplessness. The value of the Mississippi shares collapsed faster than they had risen, plummeting from highs of 10,000 livres to the value of waste paper, wiping out the fortunes of dukes and chimney sweeps alike, leaving thousands destitute and sparking a wave of suicides that filled the Seine with the bodies of the ruined. The rage of the mob turned on Law, the foreigner, the Protestant, the sorcerer, who had bewitched them, and they surrounded his palace, shattering his windows with stones and demanding his head, forcing the regent to spirit him away in the dead of night for his own protection. Law, who had briefly held the world in his palm, fled France with nothing but a few coins and a diamond ring, leaving behind a nation traumatized by inflation, deeply suspicious of banks, and economically crippled for decades to come, a scar on the French psyche that would delay the development of a modern financial system in France for nearly a century. He spent his final years as he had begun them wandering the gambling halls of Europe, a grey and ghostly figure haunting the tables of Venice, insisting to anyone who would listen that his system was sound, that it was only the panic of the people that had ruined it until he died in poverty and obscurity in 1729, buried in a church floor that people walked over without knowing that beneath their feet lay the architect of the first modern financial catastrophe. His legacy, however, survived him. A cautionary tale of hubris and the terrifying power of the printing press. A story that repeats in every bubble and crash, reminding us that while the instruments of finance may change from paper notes to digital tokens, the underlying psychology of greed, delusion, and the inevitable return to reality remains the eternal flaw in the human condition, a testament to the man who bought the world with imaginary money and paid for it with the ruin of an empire.